Back to Data in Focus. The Gauteng Police Service report of a dramatic rise in violent crimes has economists scratching their heads. At the core of today's shocking quarterly crime statistics is the impact of crime on local economies. The statistics tabled by the Gauteng Police Commissioner Lieutenant General Elias Mawela revealed a 45.2% increase in murders between January and March this year. Now, economists are wondering whether we will be able to measure the impact of high crime levels on the province's economy. Here to answer some of that, we're joined by the development economist and ESG Analytical Manager Director, Sifiso Skenjana. Sifiso, good evening and thank you very much for your time. There certainly is an index and a lot of literature that looks at peace trends and the economic value of peace and stability, particularly in developing countries where they measure the tangible and the intangible costs of unstable countries in as far as peace is concerned. But are we able to measure the impact of economic, or rather the impact of crime on economic growth, particularly here in South Africa?
I mean, it's an important question, and I think often when we think about crime, we've often thought about it in context, of course, the victims and what it does in terms of destabilizing households, homes, or infrastructure, etc. But we haven't then gone down to look at what are the costs of reparation for anything that is broken or damaged on the back of crime, and what is broken in terms of the development index of humans when people can't go libraries, for example, because there's gang violence around them. It means also school dropout rates increase. It means your developmental process dwindles over time. And so simply there's quite a bit of literature that is looked at crime in terms of how it's translated itself socioeconomically, socially rather, but not so much into asking, say, are we able to get to a point of saying, when we've got limited resources as a country and we've got multiple crime categories, how do we decide where to put the best rand available to us so that we can minimize the highest, or the area with the highest amount of impact from crime? And so some countries have started looking at that. Australia has looked at that. India, in Australia, I think at some point crime was costing as much as 3.5% of their GDP. India also looked at that. Italy has also looked at that. And I'm saying, there's a research gap in South Africa, so that we need to get to a point of saying we are fiscally constrained, we understand exactly where the biggest sore points in terms of how it trickles economically. Let's also focus on that as an area of intervention, because we can't fix everything at the same time.
Yeah. So what are the indicators? What are the possible, what do you say, mechanisms through which crime is transmitted into a poor performing economy?
So as I mentioned earlier, it is on the one side, it is around human capital development, and simply, a lot of the research that was done in South Africa found that, in fact, crime can cost the economy up to about 7.8% of GDP, and that was as far back as 2007. And that's, as I said, is that looking at just how it directly impacts the developmental process of human capital. And
so let's expand on that developmental process of human capital. In other words, you mean human capital, people who are supposed to be productive in the economy get hampered by the fact that they experience crime, and I suppose in a way affects their productivity.
Yeah, so just look at poverty, for example. We often look at poverty in its multidimensional lenses. So it's nutrition, it's wage, it's academic achievement, it's social capital or social mobility, and it's health. And when you look at crime, what it does, if someone gets stabbed, for example, life expectancy drops. If you can't make it to libraries, your dropout rates increases. If you can't make it to work, your wage context decreases. When you look at, of course, then all of that, it also then results in negative nutritional outcomes as well. And so all of the things that become critical drivers of poverty, actually crime is a direct contributor to those, and that's just looking at the developmental picture. And then you can get into a sectoral one as well. mean, if you think about tourism and the impact that can have from keeping tourists away, etc., because of perceptions of crime. If you look at agriculture in South Africa, some of the studies have shown that crime has contributed to almost a percent of GDP just by virtue of what it's done to agriculture as well. And so there are lots of ways in which this thing transmits into the economy in a way in which it actually makes our journey into development a lot more onerous. And this is exactly the point I was trying to make in the study I was doing, is that simply let us get into understanding just those sore points so that we actually can be a little bit more empowered around how to redirect very limited fiscal resources at this point in time.
Speaking of redirecting very limited fiscal resources on crime, talk to me about how then this destabilizes institutions. For example, Shamila Batoy was speaking to Parliament today, lamenting how poor controls at municipalities, for example, are eating up resources of the NPA that should be fighting bigger crimes. You know, just have controls at municipalities so that we don't always have to be chasing municipalities who are corrupt, basically, for lack of a better word. How does the crime destabilize our institutions?
I mean, just on correctional and judicial costs, some of the research suggests that that's something that bites about 0.9% of our GDP. That's almost 1% just on correctional and judicial costs, right? And so that's the one thing as I said, is that when you look at crime, often you want to look only on those who are directly impacted, not on the reparation costs. And in fact, what we are seeing even in the developed world, the cost of reparation makes up now 58% of overall cost of crime to the economy. And so what it does is that now we need to redirect resources. We need to bolster police when we shouldn't be bolstering police. We should be having commissions for cable theft. We need to be, and those are all correctional and judicial costs. And if that can cost up to 1% of GDP, and we're in a context right now where we're struggling to grow the economy, people are struggling to get access to jobs, and then you've got just the cost of reparation from a judicial point of view is that much, you start to realize just the kind of impact it's got in terms of our institutional quality. Over and above that, then it's also around, when you think about the institutions on the other side, it's the damage to infrastructure, and now trying to first get back that infrastructure, and then then it lowers investment. It lowers, of course, as well, confidence, etc. And all of those things ultimately result in employment sentiment and investment sentiment as well. And so it certainly is a multidimensional complexity. But I think when you actually then get into the number and say, actually, just the point of putting infrastructure to prevent crime is already costing 58% of the overall cost of crime, you start to realize just how problematic it is.
Yeah, and by investment sentiment, I suppose you're also referring to business confidence, in the sense that businesses would want to invest, for example, building another factory, considering the crime rate in those particular areas. And that could certainly have a more wider impact on the question of employment as well.
100%, and we saw that in KZN, right? The spas that closed and said they're never coming back. A couple of other guys said they're going to move their factories to other areas because they just can't stay there. And I mean, that is a province that contributes with 16% to GDP and about 22% to our manufacturing capacity. And now when people just say we're actually ready to pack up and go, it means those people, they're either going to need to move into urban areas where they can find job opportunities, creates population density issues, so many things that become problematic just on the advent of the existence of a certain kind of crime in those areas. And this is what you're talking about as well as about business confidence, is that it becomes difficult to invest also into expanding your plant, etc., when you know that overnight the batteries that are sitting on the towers are up for sale at this point in time, etc. So it's really quite difficult for businesses as well at this point in time, and just makes the entire environment untenable.
The impact of crime on economic, let me attempt this word, liberalization. I knew I was going to mess it up. Liberalization. We are speaking of free trade across the continent. And how do the nations look at us and our accession of openness to trade, and then they're looking at the levels of crime?
Sure, and I mean, I think this is quite an interesting one. South Africa, and these are conservative estimates. This is work we did with Business Leadership South Africa. South Africa is losing on average about 100 million a month on illicit trade in terms of tax revenues. And this is the most conservative estimate that we've landed on at this point in time. And so now when you think about trade liberalization, is simply around how open is your economy. So when your economy is a little bit more closed, it becomes very difficult for people to move around and express themselves economically, and then it opens routes for illicit trade. And we saw that during the lockdown. South Africa is the only country in the world where an illicitly traded cigarette sold more than over-the-counter cigarettes. And we saw that when the lockdown came, it opened an entire boom market for the illicit trade industry. And so on the one side, it's in your best interest to economically liberalize, because when you don't, you actually create vacuums for illicit behavior. And that also then makes it difficult to manage your ports, manage your borders, and these are all the things that South Africa is also struggling with at this point in time. And so on the one side, people say, open up your economy. It's actually it makes you vulnerable to external competition. But on the other side, it's that it's going to impact people. People are going to drink things that they think are Panado when it's not. They're going to, buy certain things that are not, because these are illicit goods as well. And those also result in negative health outcomes. So it just doesn't go beyond the loss of tax revenue, but also these illicit goods actually make people ill, and it also again reduces life expectancy and a whole lot of things, and then pushes people further into the poverty fringes as well. And so to liberalize your economy at this point in time, I think, is an incredible opportunity to also disincentivize illicit behavior. And these are all the things that we ought to think about when we are trying to fight challenges of illicit trade in South Africa.
Sifiso, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Development Economist and ESG Analytics Managing Director, Sifiso Skenjana, helping us in that conversation.